Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you from wherever you are listening in from. It is your host, Diego Ife, and you are listening to another edition of the Boon podcast, Africa Bulletin. Now, as you may know, we covered Nigeria on part one of this Africa Bulletin roundup of events, and the next country on the agenda is in Ghana. Now, in more recent news, Cadbury maker Mondelez has pledged to invest $600 million on sustainable cocoa sourcing. This was amid tensions with Ghana and Ivory Coast as to which countries produce much of the global crop and of meeting the chocolate industry's requirements. Now, this $600 million is on top of $400 million that the Cadbury and Toblerone manufacturer has already invested in the country in the last decade. Now, this announcement is following moves by officials from Ghana and Ivory Coast to boycott the meeting of the World Cocoa Federation held in Brussels in protest at the low revenue received by its farmers. Now, in Ghana, its farmers are subsisting on $1 a day, and its Ivorian counterparts are subsisting on 78 cents per day. This is well below the World Bank's extreme poverty line of $2.15 per a day. Now, Ghana and Ivory Coast account for 60% of the world's cocoa production, and due to what has been said to be an inadequate amount of revenue received, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, and Cameroon are considering forming parts of a cocoa cartel, much like the OPEC cartel. Combined, four countries that amounts to 75% of the world's cocoa production. Now, Nestle has made its own contribution in the space by committing resources to trying to limit child labour, much of which is actually relied upon to produce the cocoa quotas required. And according to Jonathan Parkman at the commodities brokers Marex, the market will not commit to paying more for cocoa above recent market rates. Now, there is a view that has prevailed that cocoa funds local communities, training schools, and according to Mondelez CEO, that's Dirk van der Put, he believes that it's a more effective approach to incentivize farmers with the provision of fertilizers and training, as there's a switch towards more sustainable cocoa cultivation rather than actually committing financial resources themselves. Now, one can argue that this issue can be looked in several ways. Well, on the one hand, there's no denying that these farmers deserve a better rate. I mean, something's going to ultimately have to give, and the requests are by all means very reasonable. Now, the challenge that you have is that Mondelez is a publicly listed company, and in the event that they would commit to paying, and not just them, but also other industry incumbents would commit to paying higher commodity prices, that will have to be passed on to the end consumer. Now, that might have an impact on subsequent demand for chocolate products, and of course, there's no real possibility that chocolate is going to completely cease to be purchased, but it may put downward pressure on prices. This will end up costing jobs. So using this hypothetical example, in the short term, there will be that increase, right? But then in the long run, it may actually be more painful. So that's something that has to be considered. The other key factor, which is very critical, are reports that have emerged of corruption and mismanagement in Ghana's cocoa industry. Now, according to the World Bank, in their 2017 report, underinvestment and underpay by the Ghana Cocoa Board's regulator has meant that from 2010 to 2011, the quantity of cocoa produced by Ghana, which was around the million mark, has plummeted to 800,000 since 2017. Now, this has been attributed to successive governments treating revenue collection as more important than the total output of cocoa production, and of which the quantity has actually become more of a secondary consideration. Now, the key things to note furthermore, and the report went on to say that reforms to the cocoa boards, or cocoa bods, which is Ghana's cocoa board, such as institutional changes, could actually lead to an improvement in the revenue that the Ghanaian farmers receive. And this apparently would require very minimal output, expenditure-wise. Now, Cocoa Bod has also control over the distribution of fertilizers and disease-controlling chemicals, which is very necessary to optimize Ghana cocoa production. Now, its mismanagement has hurt production, as much of these fertilizers have ended up being sold in the black market after having been smuggled out of Ghana, have been sold in neighboring countries. Of course, this is attributable to reasons why part of the quota has not been fulfilled. Now, according to a more recent report, Nana Akufo-Addo had targeted a restoration of the cocoa output to 1 million tons by 2020. However, reports of nepotism and corruption still persist. And notwithstanding the reasonable request by the farmers to increase the prices of cocoa received, the price had already increased by 28% during the 2022-2021 season. So this ought to be taken into account. The question now has to be asked or considered whether it's the inadequate prices paid on the global commodities markets for cocoa, or if indeed it is Ghanaian mismanagement at the governmental state level. Now, you the viewer, it will be best left to you to draw your own conclusions. Now, staying on Ghana, in other news, the national daily minimum wage for 2023 has been increased by 10%, and there's also been a 15% increase in the cost of living allowance. Food inflation has officially increased by 34.9% in the Upper Eastern region, 47.63% in the Northeast region, 33.1% in the Northern region, and 27% in the Upper West. Although it is important to note that many of the inhabitants in the Upper Eastern region believe the actual rate of inflation is actually underreported, as prices have been steeply increasing with no sight in end. And that concludes our coverage on Ghana. Next on the agenda will be Kenya. Kenya will be the next country that will be covered. Thank you for tuning in, and until the next time.